natural dyeing process needs to be done with natural fibers. It won't work with synthetic. Basically what you're doing is you're extracting pigment from plants or bugs. So it's a process that involves extraction from the plant and then preliminary preparation with the fiber, and then basically you heat up the fiber in the dye bath. It's called dye liquor. That's how it's done. It's sort of in between cooking and science, the process of natural dyeing. They're basically metal salt. You need to mordant your fiber with a metal salt prior to dyeing. That allows the pigment to actually bite onto the fiber. So it makes the color light fast and color fast, more or less. Some of the mordants that used to be used back in the 70s are sort of toxic, like chrome and tin. We don't use those now. Most natural dyers who are practicing currently, they only use mordants like alum, which is aluminum sulfate, and ferrous sulfate, which is iron. Those are the two that are most commonly used. You need to use a different mordant for like different types of fibers. The alum is really good for wool, and then for plant fibers like cotton and linens, you want to use tannin, which is tannic acid, which occurs naturally in things like tea. And you see it in wood, and I buy it in extract form for the purpose of mordanting my fiber. And it comes from wood from a mulberry tree. It gets a little complicated because the tannins are actually, they're also a substantive dye, which means that they don't need a mordant. A lot of the natural dyeing process is about just experimentation and taking really precise documentation of what you do so that you can repeat the process, right? It's really critical to keep copious notes because you need to have as much information as possible because there are so many variables. So you really want to cut out as much guesswork as you can. You try to be as thorough with your documentation as possible. There will always be some kind of variation, and I see this even when I buy powdered extracts, for example, which with the mordants I buy, there's variation with that even per supplier and where they get it from, and the extracts make it a little bit more controlled, but there's still variation in it. Well, the green market became really important to me because I was really interested in the resources that travel from upstate New York into the city, and the relationship that this small geographic area has to the larger state of New York, particularly in terms of the economically. And I was living upstate on a farm at the time, and my neighbor was farming our property, and so I became really interested in this connection between the two places. So I started to think about the resources, and it led me to the marketplace. I thought that the marketplace was really interesting in the dynamic that occurs there socioeconomically. I liked the way farmers inherently sort of barter materials, which is sort of this alternative economy, you know, of bartering, and they do that because it's a smaller sort of localized marketplace. Even though we live in a market economy, capitalist market economy, that context of a small marketplace sort of just enables the exchange of goods through bartering. And so all of that sort of interested me, and I started to think about how important the local marketplace is for the farming economies in upstate New York, and not just the flour and vegetable growers, but also like the fiber producers, the meat producers. So then it led me to this idea of like byproduct. You know, the farmer that produces meat also produces wool, and then I started to think about the honey supplier makes beeswax and how that can be used as a resist dyeing method on textiles. So all of this stuff started to really become kind of fodder for me to like experiment with textiles and designing textiles. So that's really what brought me to the green market. And I really love the social engagement that happens there. There's this really great sort of engagement with the public where people just really respond to the materials that we're working with. There's something that is extremely cross-cultural. Everyone can sort of relate to it on some level. It encourages participatory sort of making. People would come over and start to play around with us and make things or spin with us, and I'm still working with that idea of collaborative projects, and making things with the public. It's just, for me, it's a really nice way to stimulate a dialogue about the origin of materials, life cycle, where our clothing comes from. So to get people to think about that more, so maybe they'll make better choices when they go to buy clothing. Or maybe they'll think twice about throwing something away, and maybe they'll want to mend it. That's something that we do at the green markets with the public, is we mend things. This idea of handcrafting is something that interests me a lot, and I'm very curious about this relationship between industrial production and artisanal production, so handcrafting and the industry, and how maybe commercial form of production can kind of support more artisanal, localized production. So the interplay between those two things is something that I've been examining recently. Yeah, no, it's problematic. I mean, I think we see this especially with the organic cotton industry, which is, market analysts have discovered that there's a really strong possibility that organic cotton can compete with conventional cotton. The approach needs to be different. And the cotton growers are structured differently than industrial farmers, that as we know it, here in the U.S. They're smaller, localized farms that function through diverse methods of farming, and where they're growing their food and other plants to help to control pests. So they diversify their farming, and it's very different than the monoculturing that we see here in the States, So that needs to be supported more, and it's really about scaling down production so that you have more localized, smaller businesses or farms that can kind of contribute to the whole. That's what I believe. I've seen interesting things happening with food production. I'm wondering if it can be used as a model somehow for the textile or fashion industry. With hydroponic and aquaponic farming, for example. There's a business called Bright Farms that their headquarters are out in the Midwest, but what they're doing is they're a company that finances, builds, and runs basically these big hydroponic farms. But they're not so big. What they do is they go in to different communities and they partner with the local supermarkets within those regional areas. They draw contracts with supermarkets saying that the supermarket will buy a certain amount of produce from them, and then they build these hydroponic greenhouse farms, it's just a really interesting kind of alternative to industrial farming, which has been problematic in terms of the environment. I think that's a really nice sort of model to think about, maybe how could that, because really that's about localizing things. I'm wondering if maybe that could happen on some level, with clothing producers. A majority of the cashmere that we see, which has become abundant out there in the marketplace, we see it with some of these chain stores like Uniqlo, and you can buy cashmere sweaters all of a sudden for $80, or less. And the quality has changed. The farmers, which are mostly pastoral sort of farmers, they're located in rural China and Mongolia. They're overproducing cashmere, and the goats, cashmere comes from goats, and they're destroying the environment. The geography out there is very similar to the high plains in the Midwest, where you have arid conditions. You can have long periods of drought. The goats are eating all of the plant material, and then their hooves are killing the new growth that's coming out. So they're having dust storms now in that region of the world, which is really bad. And there are alternatives to cashmere, which would be camel hair, which is also really beautiful and soft, and it could be mixed with cashmere. And there has been action to try to farm more camels. Camels, their hooves don't tear into the earth the way the goat hooves. I love goats, but they're more destructive. Camels can go a long time without eating or drinking. So where goats that's not the case. So yeah, I think it's about just really understanding the environment, how to not deplete resources. It's about diversity, really. Right there is I just portrayed a moment of where a diversity makes sense, right? It's because they're focusing on one animal, which is destroying the environment. I think everyone does need to take a role in this, both consumers and producers of things.